Okay, so we're going to talk about identities and roles. And really, what this comes down to is you got an application. You really need to capture somewhere what all the identities are that you're going to use in different places. And then when those are calling somewhere, what role do you expect it to have? What capability? So identities represent a caller, and the permissions or the roles are what the receiver uses to figure out what that identity, because multiple identities can play the same role. They can have the same permissions. So if we look at this app, right, the players that we're going to need identifiers for are most of the boxes. Well, not really. So let's see. So we have a web app, and that web app can receive post messages, and it is protected, and you have to have post privilege. So these two apps, we're going to assume have identities of their own, and each of them will have the same post privilege to write to this data source. And then to this data source, to this service. And then this service is going to have the ability to post messages to an event, right? So the service will run with its own identity, and when it connects to the event hub or the event stream or Kafka or whatever, it presents credentials and will need the ability from this account. It'll need to have the role of writer. So anytime this service shows up at the event stream to post a message, when it presents its identity, the event stream will look up and decide that that thing has writer privilege. This one had writer going in, and then on the other side, we have a web service or a streaming service that reads the data from the topic and then writes it to a database. What that means is when this service connects to the event stream, to Kafka or whatever it is, it presents its credentials, its identity. So we'll need an identity here that's in a form that can be presented to this event stream processor. And that event stream processor will see that that thing's only got read permission. So this service on the left can only write to the topic, and this service on the right can only read from the topic. And then this same service is going to write to a database. So this service needed an identity to present to the event hub, and then it also needed an identity to present to the database with the right permissions in the database. Those could be the same identity. In this case, I'm going to assume one is a cloud identity and the other an Azure Active Directory identity. We're just going to use a service principal type. So let's just look at what I said here. So we know who the players are. We actually have some external players. We have the analyst group here, which we're going to use, and we're going to give them permissions in the lower environments to do interesting things. The AKS cluster itself has its own identity. It is a cluster identity, and it is really a cloud identity. And I will change that to say cloud identity in some other presentation. And then we have a web producer, which are the two apps that post messages to this service. They're both going to each have their own service principal because we don't know what there might not be written in cloud. There could be on any platform. And so we're going to use a kind of a highly portable service principal identifier here. And then so that's the web producer. And then these are the two services. You can kind of just see this at the top of the page. The web service itself is going to run with a cloud identity, Cloud WS Web Service Dev. And then the event processor is going to run with the EP, Cloud EP Dev, right? And that's when it needs to connect to something using a cloud identity. If it's got to use a service principal, it'll have two. So a lot of times an application will have two identifiers, depending on the tech stack. So the cloud identity will be one, and the service principal with the other. A lot of cloud vendors really want to get to an all cloud identity, so you wouldn't need service principals or Active Directory for that. I think that'd be great, but as long as we're integrating legacy platforms with modern, that's not going to work. So each of these groups also has an identity in prod, and that identity may have no permissions anywhere, but typically what I'll do is recommend that we create accounts or identities all the way across the board, across all the SDLC with similar names so that we can find them. And in some cases, they'll have permission, in some cases, they won't. So if we look at the roles being played, right? So we have these identities, which are then presented to a callee, to the one being called, and that thing that's called is going to have to map that identity to a set of permissions, usually based on a role. So in this case, the web event capture, right? It has a role on it called post. And the question is, how many entities are allowed to post to that? They'll end up having to have that post permission. And so in this case, the customer service principal and the sales service principal, those are the two web apps on the left, those are both going to be able to do post to the web capture. And in the lower environment, the lowest environment, the testers can manually, using Postman or something, they can post requests into this thing to test it. And you'll notice in prod, they're not allowed to post random data into it, but in dev, we don't really care. So we're going to have 3 of the identities we've got will all have the same permission to post messages to the web capture. If we look at, and remember, these are roles, so with identities, we looked at all the actors. With roles, we're looking at all the receivers, right? So in this case, the events, this would be the event stream itself, the event processor, because the web apps the 2 other apps don't call each other. So there'll be really 3 kinds of permissions sitting on the event processor. There's update, read, and manage. And we know that the web endpoints need to have update, and we know that the database writers got to have read, and we know somebody's got to be able to get there and manage the cluster. So in this case, I'm going to assume that it is the cloud web service that has the ability to write. So external entities post to this web service, the service then writes it to the topic. So the web service has got to have update privilege. And then the processor, the event processor process on the right-hand side of this, the one that's going to write to the database, has to have reader role on the events. So we have one application, its identity is bound to an updater role. We have the other application, its identity is bound to a reader role. And in this case, I assume DevOps is going to come in and manage this event hub or event, whatever you want to call it, broker kind of environment. And so we're going to give the DevOps team permission to operate under the manager role. And this should probably actually be, I don't know, SP. Okay, and then in the database itself, we have the exact same thing, right? So that when the event processor first it reads from the event stream, and then it writes to the database. So to write to the database, it actually needs to have updater permission. So you can see here that this database, we have cloud event processor dev has updater. And that's probably the most important permission on a regular basis. And then the manager role, management role, it's still the DevOps identity that's passed to it. So the database has an updater role. That's because the event processor is going to write there. And then the event processor might need to read data to write it. And so we're going to give it read permission. And then the tester dev in the dev environment will have reader role. Okay? So in this case, we have a database with 3 roles. We're going to fill in the identities that have access to those roles. And so if you do this across every environment, like actually here, I'm looking at this one, right? So, hey, the database, the testers have a reader role. Well, in prod, that doesn't make any sense. So we got to make sure we remove the permission. So that's what you want to do. You go and find a diagram of your system, identify all the participants, make sure you know what identities they're going to have. They'll either be cloud identities or they'll be something like an Active Directory identity. And then anything that receives a call, receives data, something is called in, will have to have an identity role binding, right? And so in this case, the web service for the identities for these 2 calling services will have a binding that lets it do a post. And then the events hub itself will have a binding that says only these IDs are allowed to do a push operation, and other IDs are allowed to do a get operation against the topic. And then this topic, the other player that accepts credentials for actions that people request, the systems request, is the database. And so the database will have its own permission mapping against the identity that is presented to it by the writer app. So that's it. I hope that makes sense. What you need to do is draw a picture of your app and then identify the identities for each of the components that they're going to run with, and then identify the roles that are going to occur in everything that can be authenticated to, and then we'll drag in the identities that have access to those roles. Have a great day.